for Professional Development, and I'm moderating the talk here for Sharon Green. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'm going to address them to Sharon when she takes some opportune times within her presentation to address those questions. We also have closed captioning available, so if you would like subtitles to display during the presentation, please feel free to click on the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And I'm going to hand it over to Sharon. Thanks for joining us today, Sharon.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Can people hear me okay, I hope?
We can.
Okay, great, thanks. So I work at Niagara University. I'm not part of SUNY, so bear with me as I get more familiar with your technology. But I've been doing this work for quite a long time, and my role is in developmental ed. So I work in our Academic Success Center, and I've been doing that work for about 32 years. And I started out really focusing with students on reading, although in recent years I've been working more with combining reading and writing because obviously they're connected in many inextricable ways. But my passion really is to address students in terms of their reading needs and to help faculty understand some of the challenges that students have in terms of reading, because in some ways it's an invisible challenge. We always say in developmental ed, there are three main academic areas that we address. One is helping students develop math skills, second, developing writing skills, and third, developing reading skills. And when I am out socially and I explain to people what I do, the question I always get is, well, how can you help students with reading in college? Don't they already know how to read? And my response is always, of course they do, but the challenge is many of them don't read, and they don't read for pleasure or don't read in a way that would help them be successful in college. So we're trying to bridge that gap. And it's sort of an invisible area in the sense that if you imagine a student who's not strong in math, they can not only be public about that, but often they will joke about it or boast about it, and that's socially acceptable. Students who might have some struggles in writing will often, not always, but often feel comfortable enough to ask for help, either directly from a professor or maybe from a writing center. But students who have struggles with reading very often are not going to admit that directly, or would feel uncomfortable, or maybe don't even recognize that they do. And so that's where really I have been sort of passionate about helping all of us think about, well, what can we do to help these students to reach out to them? And I have focused my career almost exclusively on first-year students, but I realize that not all of you are working with first-year students, but to some extent, I think that those are the ones that we have to think about most actively, because if we lose them, then that affects retention as well. But we don't have to think just about retention. We also have to think about how students who may struggle because they are not reading well then lose confidence, and that may affect their self-esteem, or if they drop out, that might affect their likelihood of returning to college. So I'm not sure how to go down to the second slide here. So I might need some help with that. I'd love to get into my third slide. And I know if I say stop share, that's not going to happen. So if anybody behind the scenes can help me move the slides ahead, because I don't.
You should be able to
you
use your arrow keys.
Yeah.
You have an arrow like left and right.
I see no
Just
arrows
on the keyboard.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay, I didn't see it on the screen anywhere. Yeah.
If not, I can see the arrows on your screen. They're really light in the lower corner there.
Right
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yeah, you can barely see them. Okay.
Yeah, they're really light.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Yeah, I didn't notice it all the first time. All right. So then, now I did prepare a pretty detailed handout, which may not be appearing to the participants. And for that, I do apologize. I was unfamiliar with how to get all this up. But
Sharon,
if there's a way to share it afterwards, it's really going to be helpful. Yes.
Sharon, the document in question is available. Michaela just posted the link there for people. The slides and the handout are together in one PDF document there.
Right. So maybe if we go down, we'll be able to get there. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. So I wanted to have us think a little bit about some of the challenges that can prevent students from reading well. And you may think of others, and if so, by all means, please share them. I think the biggest challenge is that when we think about students with other skills, whether it's math or history, they've continued working in those disciplines throughout high school. For many of our college students, the last time they had any kind of formal reading instruction was middle school. and maybe early middle school, and possibly even before that. I've actually talked to some students who tell me they don't remember having any formal reading instruction after about 4th grade, which is really unfortunate. There are poor reading habits that students bring from their previous experience. They might not have been expected to do much outside reading. And honestly, I've been hearing more and more about that in recent years, much more than I heard 15 or 20 years ago. Maybe students weren't telling me then, but it does raise questions for me about what is happening before students arrive at our doors. In the last maybe 5, 6, 7 years, more and more students are telling me that if teachers in high school assigned reading to them that they were supposed to complete for the next day, so many students did not do it that the poor teacher, who's of course planned a whole lesson around this, ends up summarizing the reading, or in some cases even reading the reading out loud to the students. So of course that signals to students, well, maybe I didn't really need to do it on my own last night. And even for stronger students and more highly motivated students, I mean, they're teenagers, right? So some of them are going to get a little bit lazy when it comes to feeling like, well, why should I bother? The teacher's going to do it tomorrow. And so, I'm not trying to denigrate those students, but I do think that they're not getting that sustained reading experience that many of us might have had when we were in school. Students can of course still rely on Spark Notes or Cliff Notes, and unfortunately, many of the texts that high school teachers assign, and they're very worthwhile texts to be sure, but of course these companies that provide summaries are well aware of what those texts are. And I've even heard some students use to spark as a verb, so that means that it's so common to them that they just take it for granted. Reading as a habit is, I think, becoming more and more of a problem for students, and I think there's lots of reasons why students are not developing a reading habit. And if they're not reading for pleasure, again, they're not spending that time, that sustained time on reading, where they're being exposed to language, where they're building up their concentration and their focus for longer periods of time. A number of college students tell us that they struggle to manage their time, and there are lots of reasons for that too. So maybe they're trying to read an assignment late because they've had a busy day, they're working, they have family responsibilities, they fall asleep while they're reading, or they're trying to read something long right before class so they don't have really enough time to finish it, or if they finish it, they're just doing a fast read, not a really close reading, more like a surface read. And some of them will just give up and not do the reading because they recognize I'm too short on time. And I think, especially for first year students, they sometimes can underestimate how long it's going to take them to read carefully and read thoroughly. And I think number 6 is a significant problem, that they're surface readers, like they're just kind of zipping through it to get done, but they're not reading in a more reflective or critical way. And that's a skill that has to be developed, but it goes back to, if you're not practicing it, how do you get to develop it? And of course, we know some students have reading disabilities. And then we have all these other outside constraints. Like many of our students are working a lot. We have students who are athletes and their time is limited because of practices and travel, etc. More and more students have family responsibilities, particularly students at 2-year colleges who may be older and already have children. English may not be their first language, and I don't know about your campuses, but we are actively recruiting a number of ESL students from a number of countries in the world. And although they're fairly proficient in English, if it's not their first language, it's still going to mean that there are words and references and idioms, etc., in texts that will slow them down when they read and sometimes send them to the dictionary. I've even seen some students actually translating textbooks, or at least parts of textbooks, which is terribly time consuming for them. The other thing that I think has emerged in recent years is that there's become more of an emphasis on high stakes testing at the middle and high school level. And I think that pushes students, or kind of inculcates this idea that, well, I really have to do rote learning so that I can be successful on those high stakes tests. But then that can come at the expense of reading. So those are some of my observations about some of the challenges. So I do want to spend more time today thinking about, well, what can we do to help students? But can we pause for a minute? Does anybody have any other challenges that they've observed among their students that make it difficult for them to be proficient readers as we expect in college? Okay, I don't see the chat box, but if anybody has anything, or if our moderator wants to interrupt me and just tell me if anybody has mentioned anything, please do at any time.
Well, we don't have anything posted just yet, but I'll let you know.
Okay, thanks so much. Alrighty. So I've got some general recommendations, but then I'm going to get into some very concrete strategies, and some of them are just kind of fun to do, and so we'll explore those. But the general strategies, I think it's important to require reading. I would never sit here and say to any faculty member, uh, ask your students to do less reading. Absolutely not, but we need to guide them a little bit. We need to understand what their challenges are. So it should be a healthy but a reasonable amount of reading. And I think number two is super important, and that is hold the students accountable for the reading you assign, because that in a way makes them feel more responsible, but it will also encourage them or perhaps even push them to do more of the reading, because we know, those of us in developmental ed, but I would assume many of you faculty members know also, that some students don't even buy the books, let alone start reading the books, until sometimes well after the semester has begun. And then they're behind, and it's really challenging for them to get caught up. Providing students with strategies, and some of the techniques I'm going to demonstrate today or discuss today will show you some ways to do that. I'm not, I guess, asking or recommending that we all become reading instructors. No, but I do think that there are simple things we can embed in our courses that not only send the message that we really expect you to be reading and reading this way, but that would give students a sense of there's value in doing this. So some of the things we're going to look at today are some in-class activities that would encourage students to read and would hold them more accountable for their reading. And incentives are important. And, I'm not thinking about high school kind of things like extra credit, although some professors may want to do that, but building in incentives in terms of the grading system that will help students recognize, yes, if I do the reading, it's not just a requirement, but it's worth my time and it's worth my effort and energy. And then number 6, and you'll see I bold-faced that one as well as number 2 on the previous screen. I just want to go back and find those arrows so I can show you that. So I guess out of all of these, number 2, I think is super important, holding students accountable for the reading you assign. And also, where's that little arrow here? Boy, that's hard to find. Give me a moment. Okay, and number 6, and even if you took 10 or 15 minutes in one class early in the semester to just demonstrate to students how you expect them to read, that can send a very powerful message. And I'll show you some statistics that I've compiled recently in the second semester. So at Niagara University in our second semester, we have what's called a probation intervention program. And as a smaller college, we have the luxury, I guess, of being able to work with our second semester freshmen who have below a 2.0, and we work with them individually. And yes, it takes a lot of staff time. There are about usually 6 of us that work with somewhere between 60 and 85 students every spring semester. And so for a number of years, I've been doing sort of an informal survey with those students to try to determine, okay, you're in academic difficulty, what happened? And, of course, our whole goal is how can we help you change those behaviors, those patterns? So I've been giving this reading survey, and the first question I asked them is, should you have done more of the assigned reading last semester? And we're asking this question around the 3rd week of the second semester. Now, admittedly, these are students who did poorly, but look at the numbers. I mean, you can see right away that many of them are acknowledging, yeah, I should have done more of the reading. And then I asked them, okay, if you answered yes to that question, when did you realize it? And you can see the responses, and many of them during a test, but many of them not until kind of far into the semester or even towards the end of the semester. And the last one, although it seems a little comical, is also a little alarming, when the midterm looked like it was written in a foreign language. So this sends a strong message to us as educators. What can we do to help students start their reading earlier? And then, of course, I asked them, okay, now that you've admitted you didn't do enough reading last semester, are you doing your reading differently this semester? And virtually all of them, or almost all of them, are saying yes. So we can see that they're at least learning from their experiences. And then I asked them, okay, well, what are you doing differently? And many of them are simply saying, I'm just reading what I'm supposed to be reading. And of course, when we're working with these students, we're guiding them in some of the techniques that would help them, like annotating and summarizing and using headings to guide what they're going to be reading, etc. But you can see at a glance that it's simply a case of, yeah, now I'm starting to do it, and I'm starting to put into practice some of these study skills that they told me about in first semester, but maybe I didn't really try. Now, this is the question I really wanted to point out to you, because then I ask them, and I give them a grid, and they have to list all of their courses. and this is in their second semester, and I asked them, how many of your professors this semester, in your second semester, have explained to you how to do the reading, have said anything besides just read chapter 7 for tomorrow? And this to me is very revealing, because you'll see the numbers are considerably lower here. In other words, often only about a third to maybe half of their professors are saying anything explicit to them about how to do the reading. Now, again, I don't expect all professors in all disciplines to be reading instructors, but sometimes just a couple of small things early in the semester, some tips, some pointers, and maybe even some modeling can make a difference, and students will take those messages pretty seriously. All right, this is a very informal survey, but I just happened to catch it one day because part of my job is to monitor our Facebook page that our freshmen are on, and I post study tips on there. And I noticed one day that a student had to do a statistics project, and just by coincidence, she asked other students, how many books have you read for pleasure since the beginning of the first semester? And this was a second semester project. And the numbers didn't surprise me at all, but I think it's revealing when we realize how little some of our students read for pleasure. And again, it's that lack of experience, that lack of exposure to language, that lack of sustained reading that translates into some challenges for students when they start college and have to read textbooks, nonfiction books, even journal articles can be challenging for some students. Okay, so what can you do? So this is where we want to jump down, and I think this is going to be a little bit small. And I'll come back to those a little bit later. Okay, yeah, so it's not on there. Okay, I apologize for that. I did prepare a pretty detailed handout with lots of tips and pointers. So I'm hoping that in some way it can be available to people after we finish. So what I'd like to do is kind of summarize and touch on some that are probably the easiest to implement. The handout has, and if we were doing this in person, of course, I would have given this to you on paper.
Sharon, would you like me to share the handout? I gave it to everyone, so everyone has access to it.
Oh, if you could, that'd be fabulous.
It's available in the chat.
I'll share my screen and.
Okay.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I've got about 41 strategies. We won't go through all 41. I'm going to jump around a little bit. But at any point, what I would encourage people to do is to think about which one of these could be something that would be easily implemented without a whole lot of extra work or class time for you, and given the courses that you're teaching. So what we'll do is we'll go down to, let's see, where we have a grid. I don't know if I can do that or if you can.
I'll do it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So kind of zip down a little bit. Yeah, right in through there. So I'm not going to read every single one of these. You could obviously read them later, but I do want to kind of touch on some of the key points rather. So this is the first one is something that I did for quite a while, although I don't do it now that we're teaching online, but it's sort of like an admit slip. So there's a lot of variations on this, but what I do is I ask the students to answer a question, put it on an index card, and there's a lot of different ways to do this. So the first one says, as an entry to each class, students turn in an index card with notes on the assigned reading, and then you can keep the notes. You don't have to grade them. Keep them in a stack for each student, and then give the cards back to the students before they take their quiz. So it's a simple thing. It's very, very little extra time on your part, but the students are accountable. So you don't have to grade them, but maybe you could just simply count them up. So for example, if you've required 20 and the students have turned in 16 out of 20, okay, they get some small portion of their grade just for turning them in. Number two is something that I've done with a couple of our professors where I work with them and we put together like a one-page handout on what does that professor expect in terms of how students should be reading his or her materials. So the last page on this handout, and we don't have to jump down to it now, but the last page is one that I've collaborated on with one of our psychology professors, and she simply attaches it to her syllabus. So we do it ahead of time. It's no extra class time. She might point it out, but it sends a message to students that, yeah, this is what I want you to be doing when you're reading, that I take this seriously. Number three says, early in the semester, provide your students with some broad big picture questions or analytical thinking questions. Now, this is not directly a reading strategy, but it helps them think a little bit about maybe how they should be reading. Because I think that very often students, especially in the first year, when they get textbooks and they see those definitions bold-faced, and maybe there's a little in the margin, there's a little summary of the term again, it's bold-faced. It almost says to students, memorize these definitions. Okay, that's fine. They do need to do some memorization, but sometimes they don't move beyond that. And so if you give them big picture questions and more analytical questions, it helps them think about, all right, what else do I have to do besides just memorizing those definitions? All right, suggestion number 4, we know this, unfortunately, some students don't even open their book for weeks. So a short, easy remedy for this is to give students a very short quiz in perhaps the second or maybe the third week at the latest. It doesn't have to be long, 5, 6, 7 questions based on the reading, but it says to students, this is important. We really want you to be doing your reading now. Another advantage of that is that it gives students feedback pretty early in the course on how they might be doing. So if they don't do well on a short quiz, it might just alarm them enough to get them to do more reading, and they'll understand what the importance of that is. Number 5 is, I guess, sort of obvious, but a lot of times secondary school textbooks don't have all the features that a college textbook does. And you'd be surprised at how many students, they don't even realize until they get to the end of the first chapter that there might be a summary at the end, or that there might be questions at the end. And, I often tell students, look at the summary first before you read the chapter, because it gives you sort of an overview and some things to look for. So even a few minutes just pointing out the features of your textbook can be useful. Number 6 is powerful, and I'll tell you a quick story about this one. I make myself available to faculty on my campus to do workshops on almost any aspect of reading and study skills. And one time a religious studies professor said, would you come in and do a workshop for me? And I said, sure, but do you mind if I look at your readings ahead of time? Well, rather than a textbook, this professor usually has his students read 3 or 4 nonfiction books. So he lent me the books. As soon as they were brought over to my office, the minute I looked at them, I thought, oh my gosh, this is perfect. Because what he does, and he probably takes it for granted, he's probably done it for years, at the top of almost every page, he writes a short phrase that kind of summarizes a key point on that page. So I said to him, do you mind if I show your books to the class? No, that's fine. And it was very powerful because, I don't know that students think to do that. And when we think about our first year students, many of them could never write in their books before college, so they haven't had practice doing that. And it's something that maybe students would do for a textbook, but maybe not for a fiction or nonfiction book. So just take a few minutes and share with your students, what do you do when you read? In other words, don't take it for granted and don't assume that they're doing those things. Okay, number 7, this is something that we probably don't think about enough, but you'd be surprised at how many basic words students don't know. And again, it has to do with this lack or limited reading before college. If you don't read a lot, you're not exposed to language. And the more you read, the more words you see. I've been asking my students in the last couple of years, when's the last time you did any kind of direct vocabulary instruction? Most of them do a little bit in high school, but it's a lot of just low-level memorization. So they're memorizing words to pass a test, but they're not really seeing those words, or they're not really using those words too much. It's more like, I have to pass this vocabulary quiz. The other problem I've been noticing in recent years is more and more students are not taking spelling even through middle school. So I'm seeing a lot of basic spelling errors that I've never seen nearly as much in the past. In fact, yesterday in my integrated reading writing course, we actually did a short lesson on compound words. I developed this lesson 3 years ago. Never in the past did I have to address this before. So I think because our students are using computers at very young ages, there's an over-reliance on spell check. So these basic skills like knowing words, knowing how to spell, and being exposed to language, it is a deficit for some of our students. So one of the things I've done on my campus is I've compiled word lists of words that would typically appear in different disciplines, and I make them available to professors. So for example, if you're teaching sociology or women's studies, the word egalitarian might come up. The vast majority of my students would have no idea what that word means. So, you could think about not technical terms, but just nouns, verbs, adjectives that might be common words in your discipline, and maybe provide a word list to students in advance, and even maybe give them a little quiz on it or give them some extra credit for looking up those words. And for students who are strong in vocabulary, of course, that's going to be easy for them. So it's an easy grade, but it sends a message again to other students that yes, you should take time to look up unfamiliar words and unfamiliar references. Number 8 is something that I do a lot with my students. It doesn't take long. You can do it in about 5 minutes. Just pick a passage from something that your students will be reading, textbook or an article or a nonfiction book, and just do a read aloud, think aloud. And you only have to read about a paragraph, a couple of sentences. But the idea is you read a sentence or even a part of a sentence, and then you look up and you tell the students what's floating in your head. Like, what questions does the reading present? What questions do you have? What does it make you think of? And these are things that as skilled readers and very experienced readers, we often take for granted. But these are not skills that all of our students have. So again, just demonstrating, modeling that can be very powerful. You know, another thing is a variation of that is number 9. Tape yourself reading a small segment of one of your chapters or something else you want your students to read, and make it available so they can listen to it, because sometimes hearing our natural inflection and emphasis can help them understand better, but also model for them what they should be doing, I guess, mentally while they're reading. One of the challenges I see with students in terms of reading is if they're weaker readers, they tend to read word by word. And that's, of course, slow, but it also significantly impedes comprehension. But when they do that, they're reading at a sort of a flat level, and they're not in their heads, they're not hearing the natural inflection that we would use when we speak. Number 10, I've done variations of this again. Assign a daily question on the reading, and there's several in here, like 10, 11, 12, 13. They're all kind of similar with some variations. But, you know, you can do this in a lot of different ways. So for a number of years, I used to give students a question in advance based on the reading. They had to answer it on an index card. They had to bring the index card to class, drop it in a basket almost like an admit slip. They had to turn it in as they came in, and then I would grade them. And the questions were not difficult if they did the reading, but I made them often more analytical comprehension questions, so they couldn't just find one tiny little detail, but they really had to read most or all of the article to be able to answer the question. And in the last couple of years, I've shifted the whole thing onto our learning management system. We have Canvas on our campus. And so one summer I had a little extra time. And so what I did is I wrote 5 questions for each of the articles my students read. My students read 24 short articles, usually pretty much one per class. And so they have to answer those questions before class. The cutoff time is 10 minutes before class begins. They can look at the articles, they can look words up in the dictionary, they can do as much as they want, but it provides an incentive to read because they know they have to answer those questions. And I can't tell you what a difference it's made. I have much better participation in class. Most of the students have done the reading. And the way I set it up is I give them 24 sets of questions, and they have to do 20. So they can skip any 4. If they have a busy day or they're not feeling well or they've got too many midterms, no questions asked. But if they've got to do 20 sets out of 24, in other words, based on 20 out of 24 readings, what a difference it makes that in our class discussions. So I would really recommend something like that in some fashion. Let's jump down a little bit. Number 15 is an interesting one, and I do have a reference list here at the end, so these references, you can look up these articles if you want, but I thought this was an interesting one. And Phillips in 1995 recommended giving some open book questions on exams that can only be answered by completing the reading. So students can mark up their textbooks in any way or put sticky notes to make tabs so they can find the information readily. And then for the first 15 minutes, say, of the exam, they can consult their books that they've annotated. Then they close their book and the rest of the exam is traditional closed book. And so what it really does is it not only helps students do better on exams, but it also gives them a motivator, an incentive, as I mentioned earlier, to read, to do a much more closer reading of their books and also mark up their books. Number 16 was suggested to me by a student. I think it's a fabulous idea, and it was one that honestly never occurred to me years ago. It's such a simple thing. Instead of putting on your syllabus read chapter 7 for Monday, break it up into 2 or 3 chunks and recommend to students, okay, on Monday, I'm going to lecture on chapter 7. On Saturday, you might want to read pages, I don't know, we'll make up the numbers, pages 40 to 46. And on Sunday, you might want to read pages 47 to 54, etc. And just psychologically, it feels less onerous to students when they're imagining reading it in smaller chunks. So that's just a simple thing you do on your syllabus. I mentioned this religious studies professor who made notes on his text, and I would strongly recommend, if you do a science fiction or nonfiction book, have students do something like that, or maybe write a brief summary or even just a bulleted list of key points at the end of each chapter. And then have them show them to you, maybe once or twice during the semester, which then drives traffic into office hours, because we know sometimes students are reluctant to come for office hours. All right, let's go down just a little bit more. Thank you so much for moving that down for me. Number 20 is, I used to do this a lot. I used to teach a women's studies course, so that was very different than my current field of developmental ed. But this was very telling because women's studies courses, at least when I was teaching them some years ago, tended to be heavy reading courses. And so I would give students a half sheet of paper and just anonymously ask them, estimate how much of the reading did you do? And I would do this maybe every 2 or 3 weeks. And it was very eye-opening. The first time I did it, I was surprised at how much reading they weren't doing. So I would collect, comment on it in the next class and just give them the range, the highest, the lowest, and what was the average. And it just conveys that, this is something that I think is important, students. I really want you to do more reading. So it's something that's probably worthwhile to do periodically to see if your students are reading more. Okay, Ken Bain, I'm looking at number 21. Ken Bain, in his book about the best college educators, he does strongly recommend that we show students how to read. Now, I realize that this one is not so easy in terms of a time commitment. So I think that we all have to think about our courses and how much time can we spare. I think many of these skills, like how to recognize arguments, how to distinguish between evidence and conclusions, a lot of these are embedded in our courses naturally. But all of those skills help students move beyond surface reading. So I put this in here because I think it, in a way, ties together many of the other tips and pointers, but even trying a few of these other things will embed some of these skills into your course and help students think about, okay, this is what I need to be doing when I'm reading. Number 22 is something that I show students very often, but most of them don't do it, and because they think it's just too time consuming. So I've tried some variations of this in my own course where I have students actually try it and turn it in once or twice during the semester. But I always tell students textbooks are very well organized, and many students don't pay much attention to the headings because they're feeling compelled to get through the reading. So if a student can stop and turn the heading into a question, which is not very hard to do, and it's pretty easy to show them how to do it. In fact, some headings are questions already. Write the question, take a piece of paper, kind of fold it 1/3 or 1/4, and they have a wide margin on the other side. Write the question, put the paper on the side, go back, read the section, and then go back to your question and see if you can answer your question in some detail. And truly, if a student did this for all the major headings in a textbook, yes, this is time consuming for them, but it's very valuable. And this is the kind of thing that many students don't do because no one's ever asked them to do it or has ever assigned it as an assignment. Okay, I see somebody put in the chat is.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry.
go ahead. Thanks. Yeah,
I was
sure.
just about to interrupt you.
Go ahead. Thanks.
No, it's perfect. You saw it.
So I didn't see the whole thing and now it's gone. So
Oh, it's okay. In your women's studies course, after you brought how much time the students were spending on the reading to their attention, did you see the percentages go up, down, or stay the same?
Oh, yeah, they did increase. Now, I should say also, though, that was sort of a different kind of course because I was teaching actually at the University of Buffalo, but in the night school division. So most of the students were older, non-traditional students, and honestly, they were highly motivated. So I would say typically I would have classes of maybe 15 to 25, and probably only a handful of them were traditional age 18, 19, 20-year-old students. So that probably skews the results a little bit. So yes, I saw an increase, but it wasn't the average wasn't so low to begin with. But I do know some faculty on my campus have used a variation of that in other classes. So I don't know if they are seeing a greater increase. It's a good question though. Thank you. Okay, let's see. Let's jump down a little bit. I like number 23, and there's a professor on my campus. He teaches in the hospitality and tourism program who does something similar to this. He uses a lot of PowerPoint slides, but he'll do them in a traditional way, kind of summarizing his key points in his lecture. But after about every 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 slides, then the next slide has a question. And it's a multiple choice question based on the previous slides, but also incorporates material from the reading. So it's just a way for students to pause and not have to listen the whole time, but pause and think about, okay, now can I answer that question? And I think something like this would be especially powerful now that so many of us are doing more online learning, because it's just tough for students to sit there and listen the whole time when they can't even move around and when they may have distractions in their home environments or wherever they're learning from. I want to jump down to number 26. I have been using this for a number of years, and I got this from a conference about almost 20 years ago, and I'll just never be thankful enough to these folks. It's very fun to do, and it's very powerful. So if your students have to read any kind of fiction or nonfiction books, a way to not only make the students accountable, but to give them some authority, almost put them in a position of authority about their book, is to set up a book Talk Partners project. So what you do is you send an email to the employees on your campus and ask them if they would volunteer to meet with one of your students for about 15, 20 minutes. They don't have to do anything in terms of preparation. The burden is on your student. So your student contacts the employee who's volunteered. The student makes an appointment. And then when they meet with the employee volunteer, the student describes the book and tries to convince the employee to read it. So the employee doesn't have to do anything but just be nice and pleasant and, maybe have conversation. But they love it. Employees love it. And when we ask for volunteers on our campus, we sometimes get more volunteers than we need. And once they do it, they usually want to do it again the next semester. And we often get employees who volunteer who are folks who don't have a lot of direct student contacts, people who work kind of behind the scenes. We've had vice presidents and provosts volunteer, and they take the students to lunch. We've had secretaries volunteer, and the students just come in and talk to them, when they take a 15-minute break from their work day. But the students, sometimes they dress up, they get a little nervous, they have to take the book with them, and they have to talk about the book. So it makes them feel like there's a reason why they read this book, but they get to meet somebody else on campus. And we've even seen some relationships develop. So for example, a volunteer who might meet with that student once, and that's all we're asking them to do as an instructor, might contact the student again later, a month later, and say, how are you doing? Or do you want to meet for coffee? So it's especially powerful for freshmen who very often don't know anybody on campus besides their own professors. So if anybody's interested in that, I've got the materials that were given to me at this conference back in 2002, and I'd be happy to send that on to you. And my contact information is a little bit later.
Great. There was a request in the chat to get a link to those materials in number 26 there. So.
All right. So is there a way for you to get me those names, or somebody to get me those names
afterwards? If you want to send the information to Chris,
okay,
I'm sure that he can get that information out to everybody.
Okay. Yep. Oh, that's nice of you. Thank you. Yeah, it's a nice activity to do, and it doesn't take a whole lot of time on your part in terms of the classroom. All right, let's go down to maybe 27. I do this, of course, with my classes because I'm teaching a developmental integrated reading writing course, but I always have students do some kind of a reading survey, and I ask them lots of different questions, and I've got different variations depending on which class I'm teaching. And again, I'd be happy to provide examples, but it's illuminating for us to see what they do or don't do when they read, and to get a sense of their reading history. And I mean, the questions can be sometimes surprising, like they don't have library cards, they don't remember the last time they went to a public library, or they don't read a newspaper, and that's I think a pretty pervasive situation with young people today. So there's lots of things that you could ask depending on what you're interested in, but it's eye-opening sometimes when you read their responses. But by giving a reading survey too, it also sends the message that, this is an important skill for my class, so I really want to invite you to be part of our community of readers and thinkers, which is what an institution of higher education is. 29 is probably fairly obvious. There are lots of websites that have the capacity for students to make graphic organizers. So maybe encourage students to do this when they're reading, because again, a lot of students will, especially freshmen, they'll just highlight in their textbooks. And they get very focused on the definitions and the bold-faced terms, but they don't often see the connections, or they're not looking as actively for connections between ideas. And as we know, this more analytical level of reading is what we're expecting and what is embedded in our test questions very often. It's one of the key reasons why many students on a first test don't do as well, because they're not reading in that analytical way. I'm going to jump down a little bit. I like number 34 a lot. And again, this is a way to drive traffic, if you will, during office hours. And that is designate maybe 1 or 2 times a month during your office hours and call it "No Question is Taboo," or "Ask me anything you want about the reading." And maybe offer a few extra credit points or some other incentive. And so it breaks that barrier, because students are often reluctant to admit that they're struggling with reading. And if they do admit it, they're more likely to come to a place like a learning center or an academic support center rather than go to the professor herself or himself. That's admitting a lot for a student to go to the professor. So this way it opens the door. Number 36 I want to talk about. This is my former colleague who just recently retired, and she taught, as well as I do, this integrated reading writing course. And so we often give frequent short quizzes so that students are not inclined to cram. And she often gave her quizzes, and she'd call them open book, open mind, and open mouth, which was sort of cute. But the students could have the readings in front of them. They could work with another student if they wanted to, but they didn't have to. They could work independently. But then she would circulate in the room and listen to the conversations that the students were having as they were discussing. Well, I think the answer to this question is, etc. And that would give her some insight into, are they understanding the reading? Now, of course, our course is designed to help students become better readers, but it might be something worth thinking about in other classes. All right, 37, one of our philosophy professors uses this technique. And he has the students bring written questions based on the reading to each class. And then he randomly selects a couple of students in each class to read their questions. And very often the students, and then of course they discuss, but the students often say, "Oh, you have to do the reading in that class." And, you know, when I heard a student say that to me, of course, I contacted Professor Peterson and said, "What are you doing that students are saying this?" But wouldn't we all want our students to say that? You have to do the reading in my class. So many of these techniques that I'm pointing out today, I think, are designed to do that. The next one, number 38, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that one because it's a little bit longer. You can certainly read it, but this is one of our literature professors who embeds this as, and obviously in a literature course, it's really important to do the reading, but embeds this in a way that students can not only get more points for doing the reading, but can also get more points for responding to what other students have taken from the reading or what they're highlighting from the reading. The other thing I would mention in number 39 is encourage your students to take a look. If you have any kind of an academic success center or learning center, whatever the name is on your campus, take a look at their web pages. They might have all kinds of resources that help students with their reading. I know we do on our pages, and I know many universities do. And sometimes students don't realize they're there. So there's a lot of ways you could do this. You could simply mention it. You could have students read one of those web pages and maybe respond to it in class, or do like a half a page written response, but it would drive them to those pages and give them some tips and pointers on reading. And then that way it's not, for them, admitting that reading might be difficult is not so public. It's more something they can do on their own and just turn it in as a brief assignment. I'm going to do number 40 last because I want to talk about that in a little detail. Number 41, I did this presentation about a year and a half ago up in Montreal. And I always ask the audience, well, like, what are you doing? Can you think of other ideas? And somebody said, you know, maybe we should just talk informally to our students, like even when they're just coming in the room and we're waiting for class to start. Just share with them, what are we reading? What do our family and friends read? What are we reading to our children? And I thought, what a simple idea, what a fabulous idea. But again, it conveys that message that we read. It's part of our lives, and it's part of something that we even may share socially. Like, some of you might belong to book clubs. Some of you might know people who belong to book clubs. What are they reading? All right, and the last one I want to talk about is number 40, and this is the link is on here, and there's a detailed journal article about this, and I'm going to explain what one of our religious studies professors uses, how he adapts this, but it's called a Monte Carlo quiz, and essentially you need a die. So here's a die. So what the students do now our professor does this, he's got a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday class, and he does this every Monday. So he has 5 questions, 5 reading questions, but of course we know we have 6 numbers on the die. So he presents these questions, and some of them are lower level questions, like they're pretty easy to answer. Some of them are more sophisticated, so they require more analytical reading. And then number 6, there's no question. So he hands the die to somebody, one different student each class. The student rolls the die, and if it comes up to be number 2, then all the students have to respond to number 2. And they get 10 minutes. They write like a half a page or maybe a 1-page paper. They turn it in, and they can bring notes to class based on their reading, so that they don't have to memorize or remember in great detail, but they have to be prepared. Now, if the student rolls a 6, nobody has to answer any question. Everybody gets an A or 10 points or whatever the day is worth, but there's that sense of a gamble. So there are 5 questions, and we don't know what number is going to be rolled by the student. So I think it's a really clever idea, but especially because the students don't know if they're going to have to answer the question, so they're more likely to be prepared, but they can bring in notes that they jotted down while they read. So again, it really pushes them, and it provides an incentive for them to do a close reading. And they can only bring in 1 page of notes. They can write as tiny as they want to, but there's a gamble. They might have to do it, they might not. So it depends on what number is rolled. So the reference list at the end includes some details about a number of these, and I wanted to leave some time for people to chat a little bit. So yeah, there's the reference list. Thank you very much. Chris, would you mind scrolling down to the last page? I mentioned it earlier, and it's the one that, yeah, thank you. This is just this 1-page tips and pointers list for one of our psychology professors, and she and I wrote this together. Essentially, I gave her some tips and pointers, and then she suggested, well, here's how I'd like to adapt these to psychology, and she simply attaches this onto the back of her syllabus and just points it out in the beginning of the semester. It probably would be useful to come back to it periodically, but the point here is simply that it sends the message that this is what I expect you to be doing when you read. And Chris, could I ask you, I'm watching the time, and I do want to have some Q&A time, so we've got a few minutes. Could I ask you to go back a little bit right before the reference list? And I put 2 quotes on here. Yeah, on that page. Thank you so much. So the first one towards the top, this comes from one of the references, and you can see the statistics. They're saying that and this is in a psychology course, which by the way tends to be a hard course for a lot of students, because there's a fair bit of reading and a lot of analytical thinking that goes along with that. And they found that on average, students were reading about 27.4% of the assigned readings before class. That's really low. And then they increased their reading before an exam, because now, they're feeling that tension, that anxiety, but it's still not that high. It's still almost 70%. And these percentages were influenced by the course in which the students responded. So psychology, I think for many students, puts a lot of pressure on them to, there's a lot I need to know for this test. So, and I don't mean negative pressure, but they feel like there's a lot of information, so I'm going to do more reading before my exam. Then if we go down a little bit, it says, given that the majority of college students spend less than 3 hours reading textbook material, and that they feel the instructor is responsible for reviewing material during class time, as well as telling the students what's important in the reading, instructors must find a way to encourage more reading by students, even if this involves giving quizzes on the reading material. So what I've tried to provide today is not just traditional quizzes, but a variety of ways to push students to read more, some of which do take a little bit of our class time, but some don't take a whole lot of our class time. And I guess it comes down to, can we sacrifice a little bit of time to get better results from students, and to really guide them and inculcate in them the importance of doing reading. And then Chris, if you could scroll down just a tiny bit. Thank you. Perfect. My course, which is called Critical Literacy, and again, it's an integrated reading writing course. I have students at the end of the semester do a self-reflective short 2-page essay, and what did you gain in reading, and what do you want to keep working on after my course, and what did you gain in writing, and what do you want to keep working on. And this one really struck me because I think it's representative of what I hear from many students. So the student said, when I came to college, I did not like to read at all. I didn't read anything in high school because I knew my teachers would go over it in class because most kids did not read. It was easy to pass and not read. When I came to college, I had a reality check. Not only did I have to read, but I was also expected to read to prepare for class discussions. So I think what the student is saying there is I had to read more thoroughly. I couldn't just surface read. And I was overwhelmed when I began to read and saw that I had to read 20 or 30 pages for multiple classes. Now think about this. Most textbook chapters are probably on average 20, 25-ish pages. And this poor student felt overwhelmed by that. And yet for us as seasoned readers and educated folks, that doesn't seem like a lot. So, I always say to students, professors are here, you're here, we all have to meet in the middle. We have to recognize that this is a challenge for our students. And she said in our course, she learned that writing in my texts and highlighting important details helps me remember what I read and also helps me understand better. So I would end with this point of don't assume that students know how to do this or have had experience doing this. So we're done a little bit early. I feel like I went a little bit fast, but I do want to make sure that there's some time for folks to either ask questions or tell us what you've done. Can we add to this list of strategies? Like, what are you trying or what might you try with students that would provide an encouragement and an incentive for them to read more? Would anybody like to jump in, join, make suggestions, or ask questions?
Sharon, now that you've unshared your screen, are you able to see the chat a little bit better? Do you need me to read
Not at all. But
Okay.
wait a minute, maybe I need to click on it here.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Okay, there's lots in here, which I haven't seen at all yet. All right. Yes, I will send the link to Chris for the materials. And somebody wrote, team-based learning incorporates the group quiz idea. Yes, that's true. And you can take the quiz first by yourself and then in your team. Ah, great suggestion. Very good. Very good. Somebody wrote in here, my students are primary English language learners, either in a non-credit immersion class or in an ALP supported or enhanced English. Very challenging to gauge how much reading progress they are making. As good as we are with helping them with language acquisition, teaching reading it is, you're right, it's a very different discipline. And that's a very good point. And I wonder on your campuses, if you have someone in your learning assistance centers, or if there's any kind of a center for specifically for ESL assistance, if there are folks there who could provide some guidance. And, interestingly, I think those of you at community colleges, I think there are, because there should be folks like that on some campuses. I know from going to professional conferences in my field, developmental ed, that there are lots of folks doing reading instruction. I think it's maybe a little less common at four-year colleges, but there could be folks who've got some expertise that you might be able to reach out to. All right, I'm going backwards in the chat box here. Sorry, I didn't see any of these before. So also students struggle with learning how to read academic papers. Yes, which are very different. Oh, that's true. That's very true. So I think that if we look at these strategies, we have to think about what kind of techniques, what kind of strategies would be helpful to them. I just did with my students just earlier this week, we did some library instruction and I showed them how to get into the databases and access scholarly journal articles. But I spent 10, 15 minutes before that explaining what is a scholarly journal article, who writes them, how are they written, what's an abstract, why is an abstract there. So again, we can't assume that students are familiar with that. Somebody put in, yes, reading social media. Yes, this is a huge problem. I have so many of my students saying that they can't focus for long periods of time. And I'm older and I have only used social media for maybe 15 years or so, but even I can recognize that if I spend too much time looking at it, and then I sit down to read the newspaper or a book, it's almost like I have to do a mental shift for a moment. And I think, oh my gosh, I can only imagine how difficult this is for younger people who've done social media their whole lives and have been scrolling and reading things quickly. ESL students who are reading texts like Mark Twain, who write with an, oh, this is a very difficult problem for ESL students. And it's not just the accent, it's also the older use of the English language. And there's another problem there, and that is background knowledge. There's so much, like imagine a student from another country who knows very little about the United States history, culture, geography, trying to read something like Mark Twain. I remember some years ago, I worked with a student from Rwanda, and he'd been in the United States for a couple of years, and he was taking our literature course, which is required of everybody, and he had to read a short story by William Faulkner. We spent hours on that short story. I had to get out a map of the United States. I had to explain the South, explain a little bit about our history, about racism, the South versus the North. I mean, there were just so many things that American students would take for granted. So unfortunately, that takes time, but office hours are important. But again, I would reach out, see if there are folks on your campus who have expertise in ESL and or reading instruction. And so look to your your learning support centers. Somebody also wrote, I think students are reading, but reading shorter pieces. Yes, that's a big problem for some of our students coming out of high school. And so, and this one suggestion that's so simple about breaking chapters or longer pieces of reading into chunks, encouraging students to do that, I think is really vital. Okay, yep, all right, good. So I think I addressed most of those, but let me scroll down.
If you go back down, starting with Nancy Kane, there are a bunch of suggestions.
Yep, those are more, okay, good. Thanks. I give students 12 questions and poll everywhere in each chapter. I call them the dirty dozens. Oh, that's great. I love it. I love it. Nancy, can I add that to my list? That's great. All right. And then the next one says, I have students create a CPS, a class preparation sheet. It requires a 2 to 4 page summary of the reading as a discussion starter, a quote or a question they'd like to address. That's excellent. And 5 to 10 key terms. That's really good. They bring it to class and it gives them something to use while we discuss the reading. I grade them very simply out of 10. The requirements for the summary increases over the semester. That's good too. Generally finding a goal of the paper, finding evidence, etc. This is a first year writing class in environmental studies. Okay, that's really good. And I like the fact that you're doing this with first year students because it's creating that incentive. It's giving them a reason to do the reading and do it carefully. That's excellent. Somebody wrote Faulkner, the world's longest sentences. Yes, imagine an ESL student. Oh my gosh, we had a lot of fun, he and I. Somebody said, I hate math and I may be guilty of summarizing the readings. The nature of math is symbolic. Okay, all right. So I'm assuming that's a math instructor. In 6th grade, I said, I love Faulkner because of his amazingly long sentences. But I think that is a challenge. I mean, think about students who do spend a lot of time reading social media and reading online. Their eyes are trained, or they're training their eyes, I guess, without realizing it, to jump around, to skim. And so when they do sometimes see longer sentences, they might not read them fully. And a lot of times when people are posting on social media, they're not writing long sentences. Sometimes they're not even writing full sentences. So again, our students are not always getting that experience of reading longer sentences. Excellent thoughts and excellent suggestions. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to ask or contribute? All right, so we'll make sure that the handout is available to everybody. And I thank everybody so much for your participation and your presence this morning. I hope this was helpful. And if anybody thinks of anything later, if I ever do this presentation again, I will be happy to add your suggestions and of course give you attribution. Chris, thank you for your help, and all the folks who were moderating. I appreciate it.
You want to just type?
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Nancy has asked that you share your contact information in the chat, if that's something.
Yes, and you know what? It's on the PowerPoint too. If we want to go back to that, can I pull that up, or maybe it's just easier for me to put it in here?
You know, while you do that, Sharon, you know, I think one of the things I've learned in teaching for almost 20 years is that when I first started, I just assigned too much reading. I think, I just, you're coming right out of graduate school and you're reading like a book a week in each class, and you just think you could at least read one chapter, not considering all the things that you mentioned in your presentation. And so, what I do now is just I try to, again, sometimes you just have to read along something that's long, right? But if I do that, I let them know, why we're doing that, and I give them some of that scaffolding and some of those, using some of the techniques that you suggested here. And I think, that, I mean, has it helped? Sure. Do they always read even though I do that? No. But, I think we all have to come around to sort of trying to understand better why reading, how reading helps us achieve the learning objectives and goals of our classes. I think maybe we didn't always think about that when we first started teaching, but and so I've also tried to mix in other things too. So like even in my graduate classes and my undergraduate class, I try to mix in, a podcast or, a film, and try to, not just be reading. I mean, I know if you teach in the humanities, it's kind of hard to get away from that, but you could still do other kind of forms of media in any discipline, right?
Right. And I think, honestly, I'm doing more of that now this semester than I've ever done before because I'm teaching online. And I just think that there are so many more challenges for students. So to mix it up with every so often, a 5-minute podcast or a 5-minute video, it gives them sort of a break, gives their eyes a break, for heaven's sakes, and just to have some variety in the class.
Yeah, I didn't actually. That's another good question that I thought maybe I could ask you is like, um, the other thing too is that students do read, and you might have said this and I missed it, so I apologize if you did talk about this, but students for the most part are reading everything on a screen now.
Right.
And right, I mean, we all know that unless you have a good, like a Paperwhite Kindle or something like that, it's hard to read on a screen for long periods of time versus a book, paper book. And I think that also affects their ability to read long texts.
There's no doubt about it. There is no doubt about it. There's eye fatigue. I always tell my students, like I teach for 80-minute classes and we take a break at some point for about 2 to 3 minutes. And I always tell them, walk away from your computer, get up and stretch. Don't grab your phone because you're looking at more screen. Get up and move, even if it's just for a minute or two, because it's eye strain after a while. The other challenge with reading on screens, and there's been some research done on this. I have my students actually read an article from the Chronicle. I think it's probably 8 or 9 years old now, but the author, Mark Bauerlein from Emory University at Atlanta, or at least he was at the time when he wrote the article, he starts off by describing research that was being done even a decade ago that would track people's eye movements when they read on a screen. And what they discovered is that they read almost like the letter F. So in other words, if you're looking at a page of text on a screen, for the first couple of lines at the top, your eye is pretty much going to read the whole line from left to right, but then your eye starts descending rather than going all the way across horizontally. And pretty soon you're only reading parts of the first line and you're sort of skimming down. So, what he says is if you're writing a web page, don't put too much on the lower right-hand corner because that's what readers are not noticing. But it affects eye movements. And so for our students, if we're asking them to read a lot of text on the screen and they've been reading web pages and other things on the screen, they may not be reading full lines all the way from left to right. And that's another problem we have to be aware of. Now, somebody just put in the chat box that she uses audiobooks. And I think that has a lot of applications, especially for our students with learning disabilities. Somebody also put, I saw a study from University of Oregon that said that the disappearance of text on a screen limits recall as compared. Oh, that's really interesting. Yes, because now it's not there anymore. And, I do find with my students, even though they're weak readers, and that's why they're in my course in the first place, they do tell me that they like to print the articles. Like I put all of our articles on our learning management system, but most of them print them. And I encourage them to do that so that they can annotate, of course. But they still seem to recognize that, yeah, if I have the print copy, whether it's paper or whether it's book, that I'm going to read differently. Or maybe I'm even just approaching the task with a different attitude. So I'm encouraged when I hear the students say that. All right, Chris, would it be possible, or whoever's moderating, to put up my screen with all my contact information? I did put my email address in there, but I've got a Weebly page and a couple other things if people want to.
Is it in your hand now?
Yeah, it's the last page of the PowerPoint.
Oh,
Oh.
you have your PowerPoint. You can just share your screen again if you'd like, Sharon.
Or I
Okay.
could find it. A second.
There we go.
Yeah,
Okay.
and everybody else too on the website. If you go into the details for the session, the PowerPoint and the handout are linked in the details there too.
Good.
So
Thank you.
I'll actually copy that link in the chat again.
And I didn't mention, because I wasn't on the screen, but I did mention how I have been using questions. Like I write 5 questions per class. And so this is what they look like on Canvas. And I put a sample in here just so that people could see. Admittedly, it took me a long time to write these, but I had a little time one summer, and I'm so glad I did, because now I've been using them for 4 semesters, and it's all graded in Canvas, and it was worth the time I spent doing that. Well, thanks everybody very much.
Thank you, Sharon. That was really a great presentation.
Good.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.